Welcome to the Liberal Europe podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Silvestre, and thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And for this conversation, we are privileged to have the company of Lukas Sustala. Lukas is the political director of the Austrian Liberal Party, NEOS, and also the head of the think tank of the same party, NEOS Lab, which is, as you know, part of the European Liberal Forum member organization family. We talk about the ELF NEOS Lab publication, Future-Proofing the EU Budget, edited by Lukas, and where we go into realistic scenarios for the future budget, governance and institutional reforms, and what is next for this crucial conversation not only between citizens, but also involving politicians. And after our main conversation, please stay to hear Lukas tell us about the fantastic work done by NEOS Lab. But now, with no further ado, I bring you Lukas Sustala. I'm here with Lukas Sustala. Lukas, thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, Ricardo.
This is a long time coming, so let's get into it right away. I have more of a, let's call it structural question for you to start, and that is, how realistic do you expect the member states to agree in expanding the EU budget to, and you give a range from 2 to 4% of gross national income, given the historical resistance to redistribution of resources? For example, you're from Austria, I'm from Portugal. There's a little bit of question of the frugality of the other countries that have always have to manage their accounting. So where are we on that? How do you think, how feasible is this?
I think it's a very important question and a very political one, of course. And I'm very pragmatic in this regard, because I think that two things can be true at the same time if you look at the European budget. And the one thing that is obviously true, and many would agree on that, is that in its current form and state, it is not fit for purpose, right? So we have a lot of challenges ahead for Europe, for the European budget. And looking at the structure right now, looking at the size, it just doesn't add up to what we expect the European Union and its institutions to really fulfill going forward. And at the same time, you can be hesitant to create new expenditure and new budgets, given that bureaucrats have a very high tendency to overstretch their ambitions, or also try to tax more and more to get more revenues and more power, so to say, on their level. I think those.
Let me interrupt you, Lucas. Or to create debt also.
Yes, or to create that. Yeah, of course. I mean. So I think two things can be true at the same time. So I think it would make a lot of sense to be very thoughtful and very strategic about expanding the European budget, define the areas where we really need European public goods, and go forward from this angle, rather than just say it's just a question of the number. Is it 1% of GNI, 2% of GNI, 2.2% of GNI? Is it 1,000 billion euros more over the next 5 years, or 800 billion euros over the next 5 years? I don't think that these are necessarily the good questions, rather than what do we want to achieve on the European level? What is really the kind of new budgetary items that we need? What is the role of the European Union in defense, if there is a significant role? What is the role in terms of strategic innovation and research and development spending, the Horizon Europe, for instance? What is its role in other areas? So I think we need to have a bottom-up discussion about what is a European public good, and later then we can talk about what are the sums that we need to really achieve those goals. So I gave a very broad ballpark here, right? 2 to 4% of GDP is a whole world of difference. But the reason behind that was really to say that the main debate here is really about who is responsible for what in terms of European federalism. And the European Union going forward will have more duties and more challenges to face. So I think the size of the budget also needs to come up to those challenges that we face.
So let me stay here for a little longer, because there is a question of being responsible, being exactly as you mentioned correctly. So the bottom-up approach, have a larger discussion, and then there's pressure needs. There are really emergencies that we have to deal with. One, of course, naturally was Next Generation EU to recover from COVID, and now we're talking about naturally investing in military. And who knows what other crises are coming, unfortunately. So when you see those two tracks running, do you defend that those two tracks need to be associated, or there are emergencies that even Austrians will understand? We have to increase the EU budget. We have to come up with money.
Actually, I do think that if you look at the Next Generation EU fund and the whole spending associated with it, there was actually rather little resistance in terms of whether it has been spent. I think the problem here is that going forward, looking at 2026 and onwards, the debt repayment of the Next Generation EU will impact the normal EU budget in a way that it really limits its capacities. So given that we need to pay back roughly a fifth to a sixth of the European budget now for the Next Generation EU, it would really impact the scope of the budget in other areas. So I think this has been something where, again, politicians tend to do the stuff that they need to do now and do the stuff that is maybe a bit tough to debate later in the future. So it is a very good example for that. I think that going forward, the structural debate that we need to have is really about what is its role in different areas where we see European citizens really rather united in terms of, yes, I accept this is a challenge, and yes, I accept that this challenge is best faced on the European level. Not every item, not every challenge that we face as European citizens, as European economies, is the same structure. There are a lot of things where people say we need to address this, like, for instance, affordable housing, but we all agree that the role in affordable housing for the European Union is rather limited. Because it's about what the local governments are doing. It's about the policy regarding land, taxation and stuff. And we all accept that this is not the role for the European Union. So I would be very skeptical if someone came along and said, we need 500 billion euros for an EU-wide housing policy. But for instance, defense or the external border, this is a very specific European public good aspect. So there is a role for the European Union to play. I don't think that it's necessarily always a budgetary role. For instance, the defense spending that has been proposed, it really has a very huge portion, of course, that is being spent on the national level, given that national budgets are so much bigger than the European budget. Just for context, we're talking about maybe roughly 200 billion in terms of EU budget being spent, and more than 8,000 billion euros on the European national level. So the European budget overall just doesn't have the capacity to invest huge sums of money in a very short period of time to focus on defense. But what the EU can do is improve efficiency of national spending, make priorities happen that work for the whole European Union. And this is something that really the impact of the EU can be, rather than just having more money to be spent on the European level. And I think the current EU Commission, at least at times, really acknowledges this. If you look, for instance, how they proposed the Rearm Europe project from the beginning, it really has a lot of focus on national budgets being allocated, rather than it's just about EU money, because everybody knows that the EU money in this regard is really only a small drop in the ocean compared to what national governments spend.
Yeah. And even that small drop in the ocean, it's very EU-centric, which is also very positive, creates jobs and creates economic growth for the wrong reasons, that is, but we're not going to get into that now.
But maybe just to add a very specific point, I think there are what would, in the past, as the European budget came along, what we can, going forward in this for the next multi-annual financial framework, what we can really focus on is the question: what is a European public good that we as Europeans want to be funded because it really has the highest return on investment that we can think of. And I think there have been wonderful projects in the past that really had a lot of impact, like, for instance, Horizon Europe. But I think that we can do better in finding, if we look at the budget and reform it, finding new items that really have a European impact rather than just being a European bucket of money that is just being used for actually just funding things that national governments would fund otherwise. So it's really a bit finding those European public goods that needs to be funded also on the European level.
That's a great point. Let's go now more into detail. The need to have this responsibility of managing the money. And I am going to ask you then, what specific governance reforms or institutional changes do you think then that we need to have to expand this fiscal capacity and to be more efficient, more transparent, and more accountable?
We called our study the future proofing of the European budget, right? So future oriented spending is quite a significant interest of ours, not only at NEOS Lab, but also at the party NEOS for looking at Austrian budgets. So what we looked at in the past for national government budgets was a so-called future share of a budget, looking at budgetary items and creating an algorithm more or less to look at, to define the question, is this budgetary item something that impacts future growth, future-oriented investment? Is this something that really has a lasting impact on the prospect of an economy? Or is it rather a subsidy or something that has to be paid because in the past there was you have to fulfill a bill from the past, so you say. And I think that looking at the budget to really focus on what is the investment part of it, the future-oriented part of it, is very important. So if we get together for the next European semester and for the next MFF and really look at the budgets in Europe more strategically about how do they make us more fit and adaptable for the future, I think it would be a great place to start. This, of course, has to do with using more performance-based budgeting as a rule of thumb, rather than just allocating funds. Really look at what is the impact of the funds that you allocate. Do you have some idea of whether the goals that you attach to the billions you spend on an issue really help solve the problem that you wanted to address in the first place? So I think really making performance-based budgeting happen more strategically will also be a very important part here. And I think that given that we very often have the issue of bureaucracy in Europe, also regarding the funds on the European level, I think that we really have to use digital tools as best as possible, and also to use standardized reporting in order to make the reform of the EU budget happen more swiftly. I think everybody who's in the business knows that it's very tough not only to maybe get to some of the funds that are being spent on the European level. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, the Next Generation EU fund has not been used at all. I mean, the 750 billion euros that have been put out there as a number, they have not been allocated yet, and it's years down the road because it's made on some parts too bureaucratic and not flexible enough to be used if you identify, as you mentioned before, other acute crises. So I think having more standardization on the one hand and flexibility on the other hand would make a lot of sense. And this means coming out of this kind of view that we will be sitting here in the year 2025 and create a budget for 7 years that really is not flexible at all to be allocated over those 7 years in terms of what proportions will be there. Because as we sit here, we don't know exactly what will be the challenge in 2031. We have a clue, of course. We have ideas of what might be topics that are of relevance in 2031. But neither of us had a great idea in 2020 18 about a global pandemic, which created the need for the first time ever to have European-wide healthcare spending for vaccines on a large scale. We did not anticipate at all that we needed to really invest in a common natural gas investment because Vladimir Putin blackmailed us
Repower
with
EU.
Exactly, Repower EU. So there has been a lot of challenges that fly by, so to say, and you need a budget that is flexible enough, because otherwise you end up with a problem that I think that we have with Next Generation EU and many other things. They are funds. They are not allocated via the normal budget. That means that the funds have different oversight. They are run differently. It's very ad hoc and very often not as efficient as being spent through the traditional budget. So if we create a more flexible budget, it would also limit the need to create a fund here and a fund there if things pop up. And I think that this would be also a good way to professionalize the European budget and the European fiscal authority going forward.
Very good, Lukas. Let me editorialize a little bit my position here as the moderator, since you are the guest and we want to listen to you. But I just bring two quick points to what you just said, and then I would like to hear you react to it. One is the question of performance-based and then bureaucracy. You just gave an example that there's a lot of money coming from Next Generation EU fund that is not being applied, and it's not solving the problems that societies need. But on the other hand, it also helps avoiding, waste and corruption.
Exactly, yes.
And then the other point that I would make very quickly is that regarding transparency and accountability, I think that the system put in place with recovery resilience plans, particularly where in Portugal, I can give you the Portuguese example, everything is actually really transparent. It's like, here's a website you can go, there's money for here, for money from there, from there. So a little bit of, it was a good thing. Also, we need to improve our mechanisms, but do you want to react to this?
I think going forward, there will be more and more transparency and accountability because it's just, I think you will not get the genie back into the bottle, so to say, because citizens just expect this kind of transparency going forward because they have been used to it now for quite significant time and also for the big funds. But I think that we will get better at providing this kind of transparency without making it too bureaucratic on the receiving end, so to say, on the local authorities, the communities that use the funds from the European Union. And I think we can get better there because technology is just advancing in a very rapid amount.
And let me interrupt you. I think the other thing that also happened, and I totally agree with you, is a raising of consciousness, not only from Europeans, but also from politicians, even if it can be so much better, which is this idea that we don't have to, be accountable for what we do. Oh, we will, kick the can to the future. The other government will have to take care of it. Actually, I think that because of the crisis, there has been a little bit of a shift, which is very welcome, by the way, with us Europeans being way more mindful of what we're doing and what we're spending.
But I also think that a part of the criticism on, for instance, performance-based budgeting and the bureaucratic hassle it entails is just a sham. It's really about local authorities or regional authorities just who really don't have the idea yet what they want to do with those funds, but rather want to have them in the first place. So I think making performance-based budgeting more normal also creates a change of mindset on the behalf of government authorities who, for instance, access those funds on the European level and use them in a region or a municipality, because they need to think about what is actually the problem that I solve with this and how can I measure it. And this is important because way too often in Europe, we don't measure what we want to achieve with things and we don't really care too much at all. And this has created a lot of fiscal problems that we had in different parts of the European Union. You mentioned before that Austria used to be part of the frugal force, but Austria has one of the highest deficits right now. It faces excessive debt procedure starting in July. So here also there has been a lax attitude towards money when it comes to what do we want to achieve with the scarce resource that is taxpayers' money. And I think we can get better with that. And also here, transparency and technology will be helpful going forward rather than hindering things.
Yeah, and help keep the radical populists at bay by delivering to people.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very good. Lukas, this has been an amazing conversation. I will have to have you for a part 2. You had a presentation in European Parliament. Tell me then what's next for this work that you're leading, and after the publication and after that larger debate in the European Parliament, what do you see coming in your horizon regarding this particular work that you guys are doing?
Actually, the budget publication is part of more or less a 3-year 3 years of projects that we wanted to do under the umbrella of improving prosperity and prospects for Europe. This was kind of the main idea, was to define 3 pillars where we thought that as European economic policy, it needs to improve. The first is now the budget and the financial side of things. The second is more about the industrial base of Europe, which, of course, given the whole debate that we have about tariffs right now of the US against Europe and things like that, is also a very important aspect. Here, it really is also about the price and overall competitiveness of the European economy as a whole, which is kind of the second pillar of what we do in this bigger project. The third would be then look at the transformation of labor markets due to technology and technological change, especially. The third pillar has a lot of impact on social systems in Europe. I don't need to tell you that, but it really makes a lot of difference how you fund your pension scheme or things like that. If you have huge technological advantages that change also the labor participation or the labor markets overall. So I think there is a lot of debate to be had there. So those 3 were really meant to answer the question, given the sometimes very negative attitude towards the future prospects of Europe, how we may improve them.
I'm going to put all the links to the publications in the show notes so that our listeners can come and read the amazing work that you guys do. Lukas, this has been a fantastic conversation. And as I said, we have to continue going into this very important topics. I've been talking with Lukas Sustala. He's the political director at NEOS. He's also the head of NEOS Lab. This was a privilege. Thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Please go a little bit into the rest of the work that NEOS Lab does.
NEOS is a rather young party, right? So we are here since 2014. And in this bit more than 10 years, we have, as a think tank or foundation for the party, also have evolved quite significantly. So when I came along in 2020 as a managing director, we had a lot of roles that supported the party in technological terms, in terms of how it really can attract new possible party members and things like that. And as the party progressed in 2020, we, for the first time in Vienna, for instance, were part of the city's government, right? So the biggest state, because Vienna is not only a city but also a state according to Austrian law. We've been for the first time in the state's government since 2020. Now in 2025, we for the first time entered federal government with ÖVP and SPÖ, the Conservative and Social Democratic Party of Austria. And we are currently negotiating for a second term NEO's participation in the city's government of Vienna again. So I think the party overall has become much more relevant. And the role of a think tank in this regard also changes, of course. We need to be more focused on things that are closer to the political debate and the political compromises that might come in the future. I think as a very opposition-focused think tank, you can be very ideological about your publications. You can look at the big questions, even though the feasibility of making something happen going forward might be tiny. But if you are more, I understand my work heading the think tank now of the lab, rather than being the managing director anymore, more to look also at the questions that might come along in the next 1 or 2 years, and where we need liberal answers and liberal policy solutions that we can really throw into the debate and make happen. Because now we are in government, so government means making things happen rather than just talking about stuff. And it's even though it's a luxury, it's also a big challenge, given that you need completely different skill sets at some time. You need people who look at the right laws and the right things where you can really change things, rather than just have a good idea or a good metric like the Zukunftsquote, so like the future share. So I think that the party is developing quite rapidly due to the government, due to being in government. And I think the think tank will also evolve with this. But overall, I think we do stuff that foundations do. We try to inspire people with our ideas and policies, and we try to attract and develop talent for NEOs. And I think those two pillars really did not change at all, but have just become more important as NEOs overall has become more important.
This is all for now. I'll be back soon with more podcasts. You can always visit the website liberalforum.eu to know more about the activities of the European Liberal Forum. So until the next episode, let's keep making the world a better place.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.